Welcome back. I hope everything went okay with the midterm exam. I'm very pleased that we'll be able to get past that now and get into what I think is, in fact, the richer part of this course for your education on ancient Greek mythology, and that's Greek tragedy, as well as also the Roman myth that will conclude this course. So please make sure that you review the syllabus now for the second part of the course, because we have some changes that are described for you in other videos. Now that you're done with the midterm, for chapters 15, 16, and 17, be aware that instead of doing discussion questions at the back of the book, you will instead be doing the special projects. You have character presentations to do for Aeschylus and Sophocles, which are chapters 15 and 16. And then you have the point of view on Euripides' Medea that you're going to be doing for chapter 17, the trial that we're imagining is happening for Medea. So make sure that you watch closely with that. As always, hopefully you have been logging in each day and putting your name into the attendance forum. I hope that's going well. And as always, of course, feel free to write to me if there's anything I can do to assist. Okay, at this point I would like you to pause your video and please go to your resources on Sakai. Please, under resources, locate handout number 1, which there are 5 handouts altogether, and this is the one that's on Euripides. Please pause your video and open handout number 1. Okay, do you have that? So I'm going to run through some of the details about Euripides. The other video for today is going to discuss ancient Greek theater, how it was composed and presented, and that will introduce the art of tragedy that we'll be looking at more closely with Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides in the following days. So Euripides is one of 3 Athenian playwrights. Actually, rather strangely, he's the last of the 3 chronologically, but he's presented first because for today's chapter, you had the opportunity to read Euripides' play Bacchae. I'm going to discuss Bacchae in connection with this last chapter characterization. So, because Bacchae features Dionysus, it's a very appropriate play to start with, but it does have the rather strange effect of putting Euripides in a rather backward position in relation to the other playwrights. But nonetheless, we will make do. So, as you saw on the handout, Euripides was born. We'll talk about his bio first. Born in somewhere around 485 BC and lived for about 80 years and died in 406 BC. We know very little about his own bio, although his mother was characterized by the comic playwright Aristophanes as being a greengrocer, which seems to suggest that Euripides might have been a very lowly birth. It's possible, but it's a little hard to square with the likelihood that Euripides had to be wealthy in order to be a playwright, because as we'll talk about in the next video, you had to be wealthy in order to be able to put on plays in Athens. You were responsible for a lot of the production yourself, and you had to be able to pay for it. So it's unlikely that Euripides could have been a total pauper. But maybe his mother was in fact of low birth, perhaps. We do know that he lived most of his life in Athens, but that he eventually withdrew in the last couple of years of his life to Macedonia up north, where he wrote plays for the Macedonian king Archelaus. We don't know exactly why he left. The old story that he was disgusted with the Athenians because they didn't like his plays and they kept giving him last place seems rather unlikely, because Euripides probably was a much more thick-skinned poet than that, and probably appreciated the competition, and he was probably well aware that he was making a lot of substantial changes in the art of tragedy, so it's unlikely that he would just simply withdraw with his tail between his legs that way. But he did indeed leave Macedonia and actually died up there in 406 BC. Bacchae was actually produced posthumously, and ended up being one of the very few plays that won first prize. So it's rather unfortunate that Euripides did not live long enough to see this great work Bacchae finally justified. Besides Bacchae, Euripides wrote about 90 other works, and he had a very hard time coming in first place. He got beaten for a play called Alcestis. He actually was beaten for Medea as well. Alcestis may have been a problem for him, because Alcestis in that play is the wife of the king in Thessaly named Admetus. Admetus is granted a boon by Apollo. This is actually the king who had Apollo as his slave during that period when Apollo was working off his penance for slaughtering the Cyclops after Apollo's son Asclepius was killed by the lightning bolt. Admetus was granted a boon that he could pick someone else to die for him. So the one who finally stepped forward to do so was Alcestis. His parents said, "No, don't ask us." They were very angry. But Alcestis did so. And Heracles, of all heroes, happens along at just the right moment, right after Alcestis has died. And he's drunk at a party that he has at the house until he learns that they're all in mourning over the loss of Alcestis. So he's so upset about this that he does the good hero thing. He goes down to the door of the underworld, catches the spirit Thanatos, death, wrestles him, gets back Alcestis, and brings her home. Well, the Athenians apparently didn't like this, and they gave this play third place. Medea depicts the Athenian king Aegeus as a total fool. He's out in the country when he happens to meet Medea, who at that time is stewing over what's been done to her by Jason. And she wants to kill her children, but she wants to be sure that she can get someplace. So Aegeus just happens right along, and Medea manages to induce him to grant her asylum in Athens if she can get there. Dragon chariot style. Aegeus will get some help from Medea for his own problem, which is impotency. So that puts Athens in a pretty bad light, and that play also receives third place. So that's the typical thing that kept happening with Euripides. He kept changing plot stories around. He makes Electra, who's supposed to be unmarried, married to a peasant. He makes the murder of Heracles' children come after the labors instead of before it. He also does a lot of crazy things to go to the story of characterization. He makes Phaedra, who is being driven mad by Aphrodite, knowledgeable that that's happening to her and unable to prevent it. Medea is actually presented more as a woman who scorned more than an actual witch, even though eventually she will, of course, come up with the poisoned garb and crown that will end up killing the princess. There's very little about the gods or about the witchcraft aspect of Medea that really makes its way into Euripides' play. She's really much more about the scorned woman than about some wild, off-the-wall sorceress. So Euripides really makes these characters much more human than, as you'll see soon, either of his two predecessors, Aeschylus and Sophocles. And Euripides is really unsympathetic to the human condition. Everybody comes off looking pretty bad, pretty sloppy. And Euripides at times is almost comic in the way that he presents some of the characters in the really careless way that they try to handle things. So that's why later Hellenistic scholars characterized Euripides' style as low. There were three: high, medium, low. Low is depicting humans exactly as they are, warts and all, with very little sympathy as to what exactly got them there. All they are just damn fools who are condemned to suffer tragedy because they just are so stupid as to make all sorts of mistakes on their own. That means that the gods carry very little direct responsibility for anything that goes on with the humans. In the case of Medea, she does worship Hecate, and she receives a very convenient dragon chariot from her grandfather, the sun, so that she can escape Corinth, and get to Athens after she has slaughtered her two children and Jason's new bride, the princess, and Jason's father-in-law, King Creon. So all of that together puts Medea in a bad light, but she gets away with it. That could be another reason maybe why that play failed with the Athenian audience. So all of this makes tragedy very unremitting, as the Athenian audience must have seen it. Again, there's very little that's redeeming. It's quite dreary at times to read a European tragedy because you get a sense that nobody comes out okay from it in any way. Now, the interesting exception, however, is the play that you read for today, Bacchae. Because in this play, we have the god Dionysus, who basically stomps on the city of Thebes. Of course, the Athenians couldn't stand politically the city of Thebes, so anything that made Thebes look bad, they loved. So, in this play, we have Dionysus, who metes out very appropriate punishment to the Thebans because they will not worship him. That's a classic crime that gets you in trouble in Greek mythology. So, Dionysus drives all the women insane. They run out into the wilderness. They tear cattle apart and such. And Pentheus, who has been trying to prevent the worship of Dionysus, is caught up trying to shackle this stranger who shows up inside his city and throw him into prison. The stranger just very quickly just rips the prison apart. And when the Pentheus confronts him about it, the stranger explains that he has a way to get Pentheus to see the women by dressing him up as a woman. Pentheus is like, well, maybe. And he gets induced into changing his clothing. He dresses up in a woman's dress. The stranger takes him out to the forest where all the women are, where they've been tearing cattle apart. And then when he gets up into a tall tree where he can see all the women, supposedly, then the stranger points to him, and there's this big column of light. The stranger disappears, and the column of light tells the women, "You have been spied on. Go get the spy," up on the top of the tree. Pentheus gets shaken out of the tree eventually after some difficulty, and his mother Agave rips off his head and tears them all apart. So Pentheus ultimately and ironically suffers the sparagmos that Dionysus once suffered. And eventually, for this punishment, Agave will be sent out into exile. And the king of Thebes, named Cadmus, who sounded like he supported the Dionysic worship, actually gets turned into a snake. Ironically, Cadmus himself was turned into the snake. Was founded the city and sewed the teeth of the snake. So now he gets turned into the snake very appropriately. And so does his wife Harmonia. So again, it's a pretty unremitting tragedy. But in this case, with the divine justice meted out on Thebes by Dionysus, this really terrifying god, it all seems to fit together as a very appropriate tragedy. With the tragic flaw of Pentheus trying to stop this wild cult being spread in the city, eventually being unable to really resist the call of nature for the Dionysic cult. So it's a very intense tragedy, and it certainly makes Dionysus look pretty powerful, probably a little too much so. It doesn't appear that Euripides really was anywhere more on Dionysus' side than he was on Pentheus'. If Pentheus was too prudish, Dionysus is just simply too punitive. And while it's true that his worship gets rejected, it's understandable that a Greek city might be very cautious about accepting a cult that seems to be very otherworldly. And so Dionysus just seems to be too pent on destruction and punishment to be able to see any mitigating effect on exactly what is going on with this city. In any event, that is what goes on with our good friend Euripides, who appears to really mock the conventions of tragedy at times and also mock the human conditions at times. When you read a Euripidean tragedy, you read a tragedy that's very readable, and it's also very direct and blunt as to exactly why a particular tragedy happens and who bears the ultimate responsibility for exactly why it happened. It's rarely ever the gods. It's much more likely the person himself or herself who did something wrong who brought the tragedy on that same person and on others with them. Okay, we're going to turn for the other video for today on chapter 14 to ancient Greek theater. We'll see you next video.